All right. Okay, good morning. Hello. Thank you all for being here so early this Sunday morning for the final day of the 29th Hopes Conference. We really appreciate it. We're so excited to have Olsen and Ken Yocom here this morning from Seattle to speak to us. Olsen is a member of the Yakama Nation, director of DEAI, and the tribal liaison at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture. She has 2 decades of involvement in academia, healthcare, and museums. She received the University of Washington Distinguished Staff Award in 2020 for her work in creating collaborative partnerships with local tribes and healing the wounds of colonial practices. She has committed herself to bridging communities through educational opportunities, building relationships, and conducting research that focuses on improving the quality of life for underserved people. Ken Yocom is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington. His research and teaching are centered upon nature and society relations through the contemporary context of urban ecological restoration practices. He's written extensively on the themes developed from his work, including 2 books, Now Urbanism, The Future of the City is Here, which he completed with others, including Jeff Howe, our Hopes 29 opening keynote speaker, and Ecological Design. Please welcome Olsen and Ken Yocom.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Making sure you're awake. It is Sunday morning.
A little housekeeping. If you need that, there you go. So welcome everyone. Good Sunday morning to you all. We are very happy to be here. We're excited to be here to talk about our collaboration and our work together. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you especially to the students who are pulling this whole thing together. We've done this type of work before, and it is a huge lift, and we recognize it, the complexity of it all, understanding kind of how each step comes together, and then the kind of exhaustion you feel at the end of it. And so as we're rolling towards the end of it, we recognize that, and we hope you enjoy our talk today, which is really, it's been fascinating listening to all of the talks yesterday and Jeff's talk on Friday, and some of the themes that were emerging out of those talks, you're going to see realized here, but less from kind of the big picture and very much more from a place-based, grounded approach to thinking about how to do this work, how to build relationships with one another in collaboration, and really begin to explore opportunities for knowledge building and capacity building in a university context. We should, hold on, we should probably talk about our funders.
Oh.
Do you want to do that?
Yes, please.
So this is a very collaborative project, and within that we work within a large institution of the University of Washington, and we represent different entities within that institution. So we've been greatly supported by the Burke Museum, as well as the College of Built Environments, which is where the department I work in is housed, and the University of Washington facilities. We actually have a third leader in our group, strong collaborator in our group, and he is kind of the landscape lead for this area of campus and works really closely with us as we kind of coordinate activities and ideas about how to co-manage the Burke Meadow. We've also been highly fortunate in receiving some both internal and external funding to keep this work going. That funding is solely for the project and solely for the students that not only get compensated for their time on the Meadow, but also are able to kind of learn through this process that we're exploring, and that it's growing between our relationships as well. So Urban at UW is an interdisciplinary organization on campus that really focuses on urban research within the University of Washington, across the University of Washington with outside collaborators. The Mellon Foundation is a grant that Polly is the PI on, that I hesitate to say what it's about.
Humanities in Place. And so looking at place and how people interact with the land and how we build some conversations.
And then the Campus Sustainability Fund, which, much like how this conference is coming together, is a fund at the University of Washington that students pay into as part of their tuition, that gives the opportunity for them to pull together projects that are student-led projects that really explore concepts of sustainability on campus and around campus. And so we're one of the projects that they've been helping to sustain over the past couple of years and really to push forward in that work.
So I'd like to bring our territorial acknowledgement to you today, our Burke Museum, and so that you can be in the place that we do this work. So our Burke stands on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples. Our ancestors have lived there since time immemorial. Indigenous people live in this place alive and strong and thriving. Land acknowledgements are messy for me, but I know that I am connected to the land, and this project will demonstrate how we work in an academic institution and we bring communities together to have conversations around the different topics and professions that need to learn how to acknowledge and work with tribes, other communities that have invested and sacrificed for their means and needs to take care of their families and the people in the community. So I hope you enjoy our stories we share today.
All right, well, part of this project for us is to always put the people that are really invested in interest and in time and in effort into this, put them as forward as much as possible. And so you can see Polly up there, you can see myself up there, and you can see Steve is a little camera shy. He is our partner in the facilities program, but then the rest are students and staff from the University of Washington that have invested time, and so we always try and bring forward that understanding that it's not us doing this work, we're doing it in collaboration and in efforts with others.
This project began because the Burke Museum went on a capital campaign project. And in this 20-year project, we got enough money to build that beautiful building that you see in the shadow there. With that, it also gave the university and the project an opportunity to build a yard, the Burke yard that surrounds, and how to build the landscape. As we opened in 2019, we saw that there was opportunities, and this piece of land had an opportunity to be a teacher and to be invested in and go into relationship with the museum as well as the communities that are out. So a collaborative effort happened organically and with mess. It was messy in the beginning. To share knowledge, it was to bring all of the communities together. We were asked to bring the tribes in and have conversations. And we've really been on a learning journey, both as individuals as well as the stakeholders and the land keepers of this property. And it is really an important thing to bring back and have deep conversations about the history and the survival and our responsibility to Puget lowland meadows and how they were really thriving before urbanization and all of the industrialization that's happened along the Cascade Range.
So this is a graphic that keeps evolving and changing over time, but one of the things that we do want to recognize are the time and effort and the labor that goes into this type of work and this type of management. The project is about 4 years living, and excited to see it kind of continuing and going forward. But one of the things that we do is kind of track, like, what are those activities? Where are these moments of intensity, and how do we really begin to bring those out? You can see back in 2020 was when we first began discussions, and we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges both Polly and I had in the beginning of those discussions. And then we were awarded some funding to kind of help develop this project and move it forward. And the WPs on there are a whole series of work parties. We have public work parties where we invite mostly students to come in and be part of the meadow, spend time on the meadow, get to know the plants, get to know the soil. on the Meadow, and while as they're caring and they're managing for the Meadow as well. And then a whole series of other opportunities and things that have happened in the Meadow over the course of time, including the lupin takeover, which we'll talk about quite a bit, the rabbit showing up on the Meadow, and then a series of projects that we've had in coordination with some elders in our community too. And then the final piece on there, which is about burning it. We've had conversations for several years now of how do we burn a Meadow, and you can imagine the University of Washington administration's feeling towards burning something on campus isn't super receptive, but we're almost there, and we think that we have the opportunity as soon as the rains start in the fall to begin to think about how do we burn the Meadow, which is a past management strategy that was used quite often and is still used outside of the city regularly. So ebbs and flows in management. It's been kind of a long road to get here. I think now, I show up to a meeting and Polly smiles at me. That's a huge jump for me, right? Like, she didn't used to do that. But so we have a lot of really open conversations in our approach and our strategy. It's kind of a flat hierarchy in terms of how we engage with it, though we kind of lead and mentor through that. All people that are involved in the project really have voice in that project around directions and ideas and things that they really want to see come to fruition, and so we help to support that. So developing collective management strategies has been a key understanding of what we've been trying to do and reevaluate and reflect upon as we go through. If we have an event or something comes together, how did we lead up to that event? How did it proceed? And then what were the outcomes from that? And so we really take the time to slow down and reflect on these types of projects so that we can maintain it as a learning opportunity for all of us.
So we'll be talking about each of these bullets today and diving a little bit deeper in the impact and how these topics created hard conversations, created healing, and created a strong consortium who is really thriving. We're having so much fun. We are really having so much fun in this Meadow and the work that we're doing, but it took hard work. And it took thinking about how Western science isn't always the right way. And taking the time to slow down and be flexible. Research projects that are designed and with that attitude from the funders that you need to go in and complete that project with the same goals that you submitted, not realizing that reality happens and things change. And so those conversations about slowing down, listening to each other, honoring each knowledge and how we approach science. Ken's a Western scientist, has really amazing knowledge, and I'm a non-traditional scientist, right? An indigenous scientist. And so we bring these conversations and we are learning how to translate each other and understand each other, the languages that we use. So let's dive into this.
So again, some of these issues are things that we will talk about, and we just brought a few forward, but these have been really critical kind of centering points for us in our learning of this Meadow and our understanding of this Meadow, and areas that we really kind of focused on in terms of not only our own healing, but also exploring deeper collaborations and ways in which we could build stronger relations with one another. One of the things I'm going to talk about first is kind of the difference between design intent and management reality. I know some of the folks in here are designers and work within that context. This project, the Burke, is the building you can see in the image there, is part of a much larger complex, and it's surrounded by what we call the Burke Yard, and the Burke Yard is all of kind of the open areas around that, in which the Burke Museum was really interested in understanding how do you break outside of the building of a museum to be able to understand more of a living exhibit approach. How can you expand the learning, the museology, that learning that happens within the museum outside of the building? And that's a big part of what we participate in and have had a lot of support from that. The building was designed by Olsen Kundig.
Correct.
Sorry.
Yep.
The building was designed by Olsen Kundig, and it reflects a traditional longhouse within the Salish area. And this kind of living collection, the Burke yard that's around it, was really designed to reflect a lot of the kind of ecosystems within the Puget Lowlands and within the region. And the meadow is just one piece of that overall area. And so we bring these images forward because GGN, Gustus and Guthrie Nickel, was the landscape architects that were on this project. And I first came to this project because of a conversation with Shannon Nickel, the N, and GGN, where we were walking through campus, and they had multiple projects on campus, and we were just talking about some of their work. And we came to the Burke Museum, and she started telling me about their work and kind of understanding and working with tribal communities to think about how to develop a design and work through a design through this process. And so what we bring forward here is some of their early thinking. What are some of the early kind of form-based strategies that they were really investing in as they started to think about this this project? And so how, as living exhibits, these external exhibits to the museum, could they begin to reveal the experience of a passage through time, for example, or a passage through nature and culture, and how they're not distinct entities but they're combined entities. And in the upper left, you begin to see some of their really, really early first diagrams of understanding the building in the darker or the heavier line work, and then the site as a whole that goes around it. And then as things started to develop, where we work is in the yellow, and this is the meadow. And so we're working in just one part of this overall set of living exhibits, but it's about a 10,000 square foot meadow, so it's not a huge space, but it is large enough for us really to have a point in which we can all convene our ideas and thoughts within this process, and we've been very fortunate to be able to work here. So this is more of a rendering as things were coming through. Part of what I'm trying to show you within this, and these are all working renderings. These are not kind of the final presentations, but what I'm trying to show you is that evolution of ideas within the design world and the design intent of how you begin to see these ideas as a designer coming forward without having them being built yet. And so we end up with, visions like this where everything is green and mottled, and you can understand the beauty of it. If it's a Camas meadow, why don't we really make it purple, for example, and the colors and the representations that are associated with it, and then come up with these great vignettes that really kind of highlight what we imagine the feeling, we imagine the feeling's going to be like, even if we're not using the trees that are actually going to be put on the site. But really trying to build some of that out. And then after it's built, you get into the reality of what it actually looks like, right? Which is a very different environment. And a very, from that early visioning and that early intent, into a space that you begin to recognize is living and needs to be managed. It needs to be understood how it is managed and how it's explored. And that's really where we've stepped in that project to move it forward. Really quickly, some of the management strategies that we've explored in different ways of helping to maintain this. This little circle right here is one of our first attempts at guerrilla burning, I guess I would call it. Like we went out there with a little torch and burned things just to see how it would respond. And then kind of in the middle ground, you can see in an area that's been mowed. And so we've been exploring different strategies of how do we maintain this meadow. And so it's very much of a working meadow in terms of our research and our exploration into understanding different methods for supporting the meadow.
Start. Yeah, I'll try to start, and you can fill in. As we got established, Ken came in after we opened the museum in 2019, and he and a student walked in and said that they wanted to manage the meadow, do a project to manage the meadow. And so this is where the two cultures clashed, right? And so we had to sit down and have a conversation. So through this process, we'll get back to that story. As we learned to slow down, we had an incident, which was an outbreak, I'll call it an outbreak, of riverbank lupine. And in that process, we had to really, lupine became our friend. She was a part of the teaching, and she was a part of the learning because of this massive growth of lupine that hit the meadow. We had to reevaluate, again, have the deeper conversations, but reevaluate our relationship to the meadow, our relationship with each other, and how we were all gonna work together to figure out what to do with the meadow as we were in this situation.
And so part of that component of design intent versus management reality was when the meadow was planted, it was also seeded with meadow species that were all kind of documented on what should be part of the mix of the meadow seeds, and lupin was in that, but the species of lupin that ended up being put into that mix is the riverine lupin, which is a super aggressive plant, which begins to take over. And that's some of the things that you're going to see. And what was documented for it, or what was intended for it, was a different lupin, an alpine lupin, that is much less aggressive.
So as we were building our relationships and we were working with Steve to see how we could support efforts that he was doing, there was an irrigation plan from the University of Washington that they had across the whole campus. And the Burke Meadow was included, and they left the water on, and kept the cycle going. So the lupin, as you saw, they love water. You feed a plant water and it takes off. And so she was fed, and we ended up having to take about 2 years, really one solid 16, 18 months, to address this situation. The lupin grew to be almost as tall as me. We were doing body wrestling to roll it out of the meadow with our students and really spending hours addressing this.
And it's beautiful. The next image really shows a bit of a larger picture of how the lupin established. But again, so from a Western science perspective, we're kind of studying the plants and the plant community, and lupin became 100% cover across the entirety of the site. And it's gorgeous when it's blooming. I talk about a photo that I have that I cannot find for the life of me. I'm not sure what happened to it. But the Burke Museum is a very beautiful location. The University of Washington campus is a very beautiful location. And so we get a lot of folks that are getting married have their pictures taken on the University of Washington campus. And we have an image of a couple and their photographer they're kind of standing in the meadows surrounded by lupin. And then we have one of our graduate students in the back who's pulling the lupin out. It's pretty fun. I need to find that image. It's one of my challenges at the moment. But so part of this was, how do we begin to engage with this and the conversations? As lupin was taking over, what do we accept and what do we challenge? How do we begin to decide what's more important? This system that was put in place was moving towards this situation. And it wasn't the intent, but it was the reality. And so do we manage back to the intent? And we had long conversations over this because it was several work parties over a period of days and then over a period of seasons, where each work party would have added up to several hundred person hours. So the amount of people that were there for a duration, you added up all the hours that each individual was placing on the site. It was several hundred working hours, and that's where facilities really bought in, of saying, hey, you all can bring some folks in to help us out. But what we came to through our conversation was, this wasn't a lupin meadow that we were bringing forward. This was really a meadow that was about indigenous foods and understanding the meadow as land that was a food giver for for our communities. And so how then do we begin to break out of that and move that forward?
Those hard conversations, or those conversations of looking at the work ahead. There was a day, a very memorable day, we were doing this. Ken, Steve, and I went up on the steps and we're standing looking at this meadow and feeling overwhelmed and feeling a sense of loss and feeling a sense of wonder of what we were going to do. And Steve said, shall we just let it go? And just let it be a lupin meadow? And Ken mulled around and like he does in his brain, and I also mulled around in my brain and thought about the resilience of the meadow, the resilience of my people, the resilience of community, and that we can't give up on the purpose of this meadow. And so we all acknowledged that we agreed in that goal and mission. And so we rolled up our sleeves and we jumped back into the meadow to take care of it. It was really an amazing team building project.
And this image, we don't have permission from this individual for the image. That's why you have the smiley face. But we love the image to just kind of show the scale of where this is one armload of thousands of armloads of lupin that were pulled out from the meadow. And it's not the type of a plant that you pull it out and then it's gone forever. It also had the opportunity to seed in some in areas where it was here. And so again, it was an 18-month process of kind of working through that. And what you'll see is we still have lupin in the meadow. We've just learned how to manage it so that lupin is more of our friend instead of a bully.
Coming back to our relationships, which are so critical. We have created this weaving metaphor, this weaving model to demonstrate how many people and how many communities are involved, and that when we work together and we weave our knowledges and our conversations and conduct ourselves in a good way, that we can weave a strong basket, a strong relationship, and a strong outcome for the environment and the ecosystem. Things that we learned that were really important through our process is I started work in 2017 when we did the plantings and things. I'll get into that. I had to start a relationship with the land. Then Ken came in with a student to do research, and I said no. And then Ken and I started talking about what this would look like, and then we realized that we aren't the owners. And so this first bullet is who has ownership of the land? Who needs to be in the conversations, and who are we harming by not having all of the players at the table, which is when we realized we needed Steve and we needed to have a relationship with UAW facilities. And that gave us a stronger, once we established this consortium, it strengthened our access to the land. We also brought in, it was interdisciplinary. We have archaeology students, design students, we have education students, we have Native American Indian Studies students, and all of these different folks that come in and contribute to the model and to the theory that we're trying to bring, and they bring knowledges. We also, oh, that's yours.
Okay. Yeah. We also maintain this as we're at the University of Washington, and part of our work and part of our responsibility is how to mentor in research and understanding management as part of that. And so we've begun to explore not distinct tracks of knowledge building and the methods that go into that, but really how they begin to merge and how they have the opportunity to come together and explore that those sets of engagements through a very interdisciplinary manner that is driven by students and student interests. We understand the Meadow really well now. We understand what we have to offer and what, in many ways, what the Meadow has to offer in its learning opportunities. Not all the ways that the Meadow has to offer in its learning opportunities. But so we kind of understand that set of opportunities, and as new students come in and their interests, we try and identify different strategies and different approaches to engage these. And so it really is a research foundation in terms of the work that we're doing, but it's a research foundation that's led by empathy and care. And then the intellectual property has been a project that has been a topic that has kind of continuing to emerge, because even as you go back to this idea of ownership and access of the land, so is there ownership and access of the knowledge that we're developing and we're bringing forward. And there's been some stresses and some challenges of, not among us necessarily, but among some of the entities that we represent, of how can we begin to use your work in different ways to help support a larger understanding of that. And whether that's Gigi and the design firm wanting to build our work forward in terms of how their project was successful, or whether it's the Burke Museum trying to think about how management and care should really happen because it's right outside of their building, or how it's the College of the Built Environments coming in and talking about how often we need to be running classes there and how it's our responsibility to help support students kind of in that learning. This idea of intellectual property has become a really important one and will continue to be so as we begin to publish and continue to share this knowledge moving forward. But it is a piece that we have conversations about regularly, about who gets to share what and how do we get to share it, and that while our intent is to have everything be open and accessible, we also want to recognize that knowledge can be stolen and used in ways that aren't appropriate.
So through our work, we have been developing different ways to share the care that is needed. And the first entity that was sharing care was the Meadow itself. She was a little, right? She was young. She didn't know what she was going to become and how she was going to be used. And so she provided she has a voice as well, you know, the lupin and all of those different things. So we all had to learn how to do the shared care for the work. There was also care for each other. There is harm that happens, and when harm happens, and amongst our circle, but also outside of our circle, with tribal communities or with academics or with organizations that, like Ken said, want to use our Meadow for their benefit, how do we take care of each other and make sure that we understand the harm that has happened, and how do we acknowledge that we can do better as we move forward and continue to heal?
And part of that healing, going back to one of the challenges, the ebbs and flows in management was that we didn't talk about specifically, was COVID. We all experienced it. We all went through it. One of the beautiful parts I found of the Meadow was, after those initial lockdowns, the opportunities that the Meadow offered us to collect in community outside and safe environments and really work together. That engagement from students was like nothing we've experienced since, in terms of the appreciation of that opportunity. Yes, that we were asking them to work and get their hands dirty and be on their hands and knees and kind of going through the Meadow and doing that work, but they were doing that with people 6 feet apart, mostly, and masked, and so that they could be in conversation with others and they could continue their learning and advance their learning through that part. For me, that was a huge learning experience of, as we, you know, as kind of perturbations come into any given project, how you can adapt and identify the good out of this and amplify the good when there's challenges all around you. A big part, Polly will talk about in just a minute, is really understanding traditional ecological knowledges and how that builds into our conceptions and our understandings of what a meadow is. Many of the students that we work with don't necessarily have that knowledge, or most do not have that knowledge or that understanding of why it's important to engage in certain ways with the Meadow. And it's a process, quite honestly, that I'm learning with Polly, through Polly, over the past 4 years. And part of that component, the method that's used in that knowledge sharing, is really storytelling, and we'll get into that storytelling quite a bit here a little bit later. Community building is something I really already talked about in terms of in terms of, say, our experiences through COVID. But one of the things we have been open, yes, there's issues around the sharing of knowledge, but community building has been a core effort of what we've been trying to do, both within the university and externally to the university. One of our strong partners in this project is also Oxbow Nurseries, which is a nursery was originally contracted to help grow the plants that to be planted within the meadow, and they have stayed active, engaged, and really invested in understanding the meadow and understanding changes within the meadow, to the point that every year in the autumn they have there are a lot of seasonal workers, and so they come to the Burke for a day at the Burke at the end of the season, and they spend half a day in the meadow helping to care for the meadow and understand the meadow through part of that. You want to talk about it?
Yep. Every day we learn from the land, and the land is our number one teacher. She is the lecturer. She is the guiding principle in all of the work that we do. And she's actually, I was telling somebody here that this is actually very emotional for me to be able to bring this story out and to realize all of the work that we're doing and how we're raising her up, that piece of meadow, raising her up and giving her life and expanding her life out into the world by sharing this story and the work that we're doing. And so she's teaching us, and she is here with us today. We actively seek to understand the complexities and richness of the land. We talk about traditional knowledge, and how I bring that to the meadow is with the good intention. Each work party, before we begin, we stand together in circle and we ground ourselves and we bring our hearts together so that we can go into that meadow with love, with care as we enter the work that we're going to do. Living cultural practices that we bring at that moment. Things happen and we take care of them. So we'll have a prayer, or we'll share words of reflection as we prepare to go in and do the work. We also have elders that come out and have conversations or spend time with us. And that is very, very important. And so you see the smiles. They've been doing the work. We set them up in a good way.
So we've really kind of identified these three different approaches that we bring to the meadow and the work and understanding management with the work, which is within traditional knowledge, which is in Western science, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we package all of that through storytelling and understand it through storytelling, which is still constantly emerging in how we do this.
So many years ago, as I said, when the Burke was designing and creating this space, they asked that if the plants are ready, they've been propagating, they've been growing for a long time, and so they asked if we could engage with some of our tribes in the local area. And this is some of the work that we've done. There was harm that happened. I asked 5 tribes to bring, if they could bring their food gatherers to the Oxbow farm as we prepare to bring our plants to the meadow and plant them. These were living practices that I'd brought into the museum and had handled a lot of our protocols inside as we moved our collections to the new building, as we prepared the building to receive the collections and to receive us as employees. 5 tribes: Snoqualmie, Puyallup, Suquamish, Yakama, Wanapum. As we went, our elders, my elder who has taught me my cultural practices and my food gathering practices, came to do the work with me. We were going to tell stories, or we did, tell stories, sing our songs, and introduce ourselves to the plants and share with them the intention that we believed we had for these plants to live at the Burke Museum. As we got there, my elder removed herself. She just kept wandering around the nursery, and she wouldn't come to the circle and to the conversations and the stories that we were sharing to do the work that I asked them to do. After we had our ceremony and sang our songs, I went and checked in with her, and she was upset. You know how an auntie is upset? She wouldn't talk to me. And we had a chit chat, and finally I just stuck with her. I stayed with her until I understood what was going on. And she said, "Polly, this is wrong. We promised the Creator and we promised the plants that we would not put them in plastic containers. We have broken the unwritten law, our religion, and the work that we do by propagating these plants in a farm, by farming them. We promise to take care of them in their natural environment. So I was wrecked, right? I was wrecked. And so all of the elders from the other 4 tribes had to continue the work. We had started this work, and I'm taught once you start, you have to finish. But what is happening for me on this journey? And so this is her partner, Atwai, and he actually came and finished the work with us with 3 other tribes. And so as we did that, we've had all of the communities come in, we planted the camas, and we did that work in a good way. I was not sure what this was going to look like as we were moving forward. Hadn't met Ken yet. Ken's not in the picture, right? And I realized I am moving too fast between the 2 worlds, the 2 communities. And so I had to really slow down and figure out what was going on and what is going to happen with this meadow. So, come, what part of the year was it, Ken?
It was in the autumn that I showed up and brought a whole bunch of more harm in terms of the approaches that I brought and the ideas that I had established. I have a background as a wildlife ecologist. I've developed, conducted, and worked on numerous kind of plant community projects and plant evaluation projects. I know the methods that we bring from Western science. I know that understanding of how we can begin to evaluate the data and those types of approaches, but very specifically, not from a cultural perspective, but really trying to understand the plant, but not necessarily having a relationship with the plant, and this is, or with the plants that were in this meadow. And this is where I have grown in a tremendous amount. We were at odds with one another in terms of this approach, and that's a nice word to say. We didn't necessarily recognize, and I won't speak for Polly, but what I didn't recognize was where Polly was coming from. I also didn't know Polly's history with the meadow. I didn't know Polly's history with camas as a plant. And not only her individual history, but her family history and her cultural history with the plant. I didn't recognize that approach or those needs that were brought together with that and how important that was. And so I came with one of our great graduate students that worked on this project for a long time. Her name's Josine Velasco. I came with Josine. We had this idea. We were going to set these things up. Polly kind of hesitantly said, okay, we'll try and figure out what this is. And so the day that we're going to set up our project and our plots, we're going to do quadrat sampling. This is where you all begin to nod off. I recognize that, and you'll have a few slides where you get to nod off. But we're going to do this, and we show up with our rebar, because that's how we're going to stake our sites. And thank goodness, I really just appreciate this moment in time is as we're showing up to the site to establish these sites, Polly's walking by, and she's coming from some other meeting. She didn't know we were going to be there, but she's walking by and she sees me carrying these big sticks of rebar that we're going to hammer into the meadows so that we can set our sites. And the look on Polly's face was one of devastation, of what gives you the right, what makes you even think that we would allow you to put metal into our meadow and into our family, basically, where our foods are being grown. And that, it was just such a quick realization for me, that kind of moment of, for me, needing to slow down and to say, there's so much more here that I need to begin to understand. And these are just tiny little examples that we're trying to bring forward, but that have collectively built up and brought us to kind of where we are today. And kind of those lessons learned along the way. And so we did move forward with quadrat, or plot sampling, as we also call it, through different strategies. And we worked around, how can we have the least amount of impact possible within the meadow. This is also where Steve starts to come into the picture. Steve is our collaborator with facilities, and Steve said, well, if we're not going to use rebar, I got all of these stakes that we can use. I can trim them up and we can put them in the set meadow. And so we started to use that. And for the longest time, we were using basically sticks that we plugged into the ground and had in place that young kids that were visiting the museum loved to pull out and play swords with. And then we would have a hard time finding the sites again. But the methods we were really using was kind of a transect process, using different quadrats on the transect, and a transect is just a line through the landscape that is set, and the quadrats are built off points, plot sampling that's done with this piece that Josine built. That's Josine doing some of the early work, is essentially a 1 meter PVC. It is PVC, but it's not left on the site. PVC square with 100 smaller squares built into it. And so we're looking at the frequency of different plants and how they change kind of over time. And so a real critical element within this piece and this science that we're bringing forward was not only were we interested in understanding how the community was establishing itself and growing and maturing over time, over linear time, we were also really interested in understanding more of the cyclical time components. What was the change over the seasons? And so how do we understand time kind of moving this way? In a way that we're consistently moving forward in time, but we're also returning to the same periods. And so through exploring plant communities using these methods and using these kind of set methods, we really had the opportunity to do that. What you see below in that bottom right is the transect line. Is the transect line that runs across. We had 4 transects initially. We've really cut back now, and a whole series of plots that were associated with that. And we'd go along and we'd lay down that PVC square, and we'd count the number of plants or the species of plants that were in each of those squares as a way that we could repeat this over and over again. We also took photo points along the way, which has been one of the greatest resources that we've had, because that visual understanding of change over the course of time has been critical. So once a month, the students that work on this site take photos from each of these little, the kind of blue and yellow photo points at the same angle, but during different times of day, during different seasons, but or during different weather conditions. But we really get to understand and see how that meadow is changing from different perspectives. And so we've collected this data for the past 4 years, except for a period last spring when our students just didn't have enough opportunity to really be able to do that. This quadrat sampling is, again, here's where you get to take the nap, but was really about understanding kind of the relative abundance of species within this plant. Or within the meadow. And what we're trying to do is figure out not only what is the science language that we're bringing to this, but also what are the cultural practices that come into this, and how do we begin to adjust our understanding. So some really common analysis measures for the type of data that we're collecting is this community diversity analysis in plants. And we use these different indexes along the way. And some of our students are really invested in this approach and this way of understanding plant communities. And so we have a student right now who is fantastic at this type of work and really engaged in this type of work, and so has been running some data, running some of the data. You can see the sheets there are data collections. They get translated digitally, and then she's begun to kind of evaluate. The Shannon Diversity Index looks at the number of species present and the relative abundance across the meadow. And so we're looking at these across the meadow, again, looking at seasonal change, but also looking at annual change and how these begin to kind of shape themselves up. And these types of graphs are hard to read and really hard to understand. I'm not going to get into it because at this point it's not that important of what necessarily we're finding. But just to begin to get an understanding of how we're starting to translate this information and share this information. Sometimes we have these line graphs that come forward. The Shannon Diversity Index is often paired with another measure called the functional evenness. And evenness is really to understand how species are spread out over a community. Are they represented across across the entirety of the meadow, or do you find them in particular areas and during particular times? All of this is starting to give us, again, an index in understanding how the plant community is evolving and developing over a period of time. And then things get a little bit more detailed even in understanding the functional diversity. So we can look at individual plants and understand, based on their genetic traits, how aggressive of a plant they are, quite honestly. Are they a strong competitor? Are they not a competitor? Are they more ruderal, which is like a weed species, a really strongly competitive species? And how do we begin to explore that over time? Again, less concerned with providing you kind of with the details of what we found out, because what we have noticed over time is there's a lot of change that's going into this meadow. We understand now from this the seasonal changes, but we've collected this as detailed to begin to show, quote unquote, proof of that knowledge, but we could have also collected that simply through the photo points and understanding that. And so while we're getting details, we're also getting larger scale understandings of these projects. And then a lot of our students, I'm out of a design program, are really interested in working with how do we relay this information. And so one of our students recently came up with this, and again, it's about coming from landscape architecture. The student in particular is coming from landscape architecture, but spending a lot of time in a museum and being influenced around how do they learn about museology and different methods and ways in which to share some complex information with the public. And so this is iteration number one, version number one, and I hope in 3 years it will be at version number 28 for this. But this is simply a GIF or a GIF, basically showing one plot on the site over time, and each of those is it all adds up to about 100 squares, but what it's showing is this one plot over time and how the plants are changing within a 1 meter square plot. So we can understand the meadow as a whole, but we can also understand the meadow in great detail. The next step for this, the project the student is doing, is taking 16 of our plots, and then we're going to put them all together so that so that folks can begin to understand how much the meadow is changing at a relatively minute scale, but collectively.
So we get to a place that we are okay and we're doing well in the work that we're doing, and something else happens. So as we were taking care of the lupin, mitigating the lupin, working on our relationships, understanding the healing that we need to do, and also taking care of the students and moving forward, the Burke Museum was really committed to make the meadow a point for donors to come and appreciate. So we have the Burke Meadow celebration. We have Camas Circle donors, and so there was this idea and the idea was to have an event, settle down. This one gets me a little riled. Settle down and have an event for the donors to come in and celebrate and experience the beauty of the Camas Meadow. Remember the designs that you saw and that meadow being just Camas purple? That's what they were envisioning, and that we were bringing our donors in to experience. Well, as you see the reality, we don't. But we had little ones, little Camases that were blooming, but they would start to bloom, and before the flowers opened, the rabbits came and ate the stalks. And so we had the flowers on the ground, and it was just really messy to do this donor event and such. So we had to talk about what to do with the rabbits. Brought us back to our weaving conversations in our communities. And so I keep going with them. I'm in the baskets now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we brought our communities together. We were talking about fences, prevention, removal, right? Keep them out, gatekeeping. And we decided that Ken had the idea, actually, that he had a design workshop. What was it?
Design workshop.
A design workshop. And he said, do you know any weavers, and can we weave some fences and put them up to do some rabbit care? And so the idea was to create the rabbit-proof basket, We got our students together for 2 days, and we had to figure it out. We used Arctic willow and Pacific willow and red osier dogwood as our materials to do this. Steve, again, the great guy he is, found some materials that we could go harvest on campus. So we still use the local materials, thank you. And so the students went out and they gathered the materials in these plots on campus to get ready for this design workshop. It was really cool because I was actually in South Africa. I was out of the country and we've never done this before. And so the students and Ken just figured it out and they went and harvested, and I showed up the night before we did the basket weaving workshop, the first year. So they gathered it and they took it and they stored the materials over at Gould Hall, and we ended up having to negotiate because we needed them to be made at the Burke Museum so we could install them as we made them. These are living plant materials. We have pest management policies, and so we had to figure out and communicate with our operations and collections managers and ask permission to bring live material into the museum. And what would this look like? Because they have bugs, they have critters. Because they believed in the project, they understood, and we were clear with our intentions, and we promised we would clean up the workspaces that we used. They agreed to let us come into the museum and assemble these and work on these baskets. Why don't you say something, and then I'll come back to the elders story.
Okay.
Okay.
And so, as you know, Polly kind of alluded to, we didn't really have an idea of what we were doing. We had collected the materials and we got the ideas of how we were going to host this and the event that was going to come to kind of come out of it, and that there would be good student learning, there would be good community building as part of all of this. But other than Polly and some of Polly's students from her Indigenous food family group, none of us knew weaving, and none of us knew how to understand the importance of the material in weaving and begin to explore that. And so with Polly, we had invited some elders from the Yakama Nation to come and share some of their knowledge and their experiences and their teaching with us around weaving. And we really put together, we started to put together these projects, but it was something that was kind of new and exploratory for us. We didn't know what we were doing in terms of, we had an idea of dimensions and structure and how high it probably needed to be. Like, I don't know how many conversations I had over how high does a bunny hop, but was really trying to kind of negotiate these aspects. And as, should I talk about the translation between the fence to the basket?
Yes.
Or is that you?
No, you can. And I'll add to it.
All right.
Okay.
And so, as part of this conversation, we were talking about fences. How do we keep these bunnies out? How do we exclude them from the meadow? And during a really kind of poignant moment when we're all struggling to try and figure out what we're doing, one of the students from the food family came forward and hesitantly but articulately stated that we shouldn't be understanding these as fences. What we're actually doing is weaving baskets to hold our food. And so that simple shift in perspective and understanding changed the way the entire community that was engaged within this project began to view and understand what we were doing. And then that kind of frustration of not knowing what was happening, you could feel it in the room, just shifted into, we'll make this work. We'll figure out how to work together to help to hold our food.
Our students were also the teachers. As Ken said, nobody knew how to weave these things. It was all a new process. Our elders also said, I haven't done a project like this before. And I said, this is the great thing about creativity and coming together with all of the different knowledges. Our students, our native students, got very excited because they have done weaving projects, weaving baskets or weaving cedar hats for their regalia and things. And they said, well, let's try this. And they would bring their weaving techniques in, and they started moving us out of the way and started working with us to create these designs. Each basket we made was different. And each basket has many hands of conversation, of healing, of teaching, of learning, and moving into relationship with the materials that we're working with as well. Knowing that we are going into co-manage and we're creating space, we're creating a vessel of knowledge that is going to connect to the land, and we're going to learn from the plants. This whole thing was about camas, but as we were having these conversations, we also realized that the camas doesn't live alone, we don't live alone, that there is an ecosystem and that the other plant relatives need to be cared for as well. And so in these vessels, as we're doing our Western research, we're also thinking about the relationships and the need of the other plants that support the wellness and the resilience of the communities. This is Auntie Val. She's working with actually my niece. I know Reese since before she was born. And so to watch this intergenerational interaction and watch the love and the care and the journey and the sharing in that time that Reese gets to have with Val was just magical for all of them.
And so here you can begin to see how each of the different panels, and so we're creating baskets, but we're creating four-sided baskets. Each of the panels is different. They're unique. They're built by many hands and brought together, but it's a really simple weave in terms of kind of how the materials are coming together, but it's about understanding those materials and how you can begin to utilize the strengths of those materials in new ways to help conform to meet our needs. And this is actually one of my favorite pictures, which is this kind of a lineup of panels as the students are taking the panels out into the meadow. Because there's the one step of really trying to, or there's many steps into it, but there's those initial phases of really trying to build these panels out, and then there's a whole other component of this work that we had to learn about along the way as well, which was how do they come together in place on the meadow. And so what you can see here is it's not just one or two people putting them in place. Everybody comes in and tries to figure out, okay, well, if you're sticking your stake in the ground and we're sticking our stake in the ground, this isn't really working. And really having to understand with the meadow and that coming together, and then these final components of weaving the edges together, really helping to bring that basket together into one whole piece. We should say that we target where the baskets are going to go through our relationship with Oxbow Nursery, and through their seasonal or their annual time when they come in and care for the meadow. They also bring with them camas bulbs that are of the same family as the camas bulbs that are already on site. And so last year they brought 1,200 camas bulbs on the site. And instead of spreading them out across the site, we're really trying to focus on how do we establish them in kind of some dense pockets on the site, because for us in a management perspective, it's easier for us to kind of comprehend and contain these pieces. And so we place the baskets around these areas that are very, very densely planted with camas bulbs.
This is Gil, Uncle Gil, and he got into this project. That's Val's husband, and he is a veteran, and he is a knowledge keeper. He carries our songs with us, and he was out there he just got into it and really wanted this project to be successful. He saw the joy that it brought his wife teaching in an academic institution and being included in an academic institution for her knowledge. He saw the joy, they both did, they saw the joy and the care that the students were providing and the interest in the stories and knowledge that was being shared. And he really put some really amazing energy and support into this project. They were really important, they are important in the model and practices that we're bringing to the Burke Museum. To our project. We've done 2 years of basket making part of the conversations we also had is when after the bloom, do we remove them so people could fully appreciate the meadow in its place? And I was the one who wanted them out, right? Take the baskets out, it's time to put them away. And everybody else wanted to keep the baskets in the meadow, so they are still standing. And we're adding more.
Which you've come to terms with.
Yes.
And appreciate some days.
They're really beautiful.
And in part, the beauty of them is that they're aging over time and they're actually becoming part of the meadow, right? So you look out and you see you look out from this window that you can kind of see in the upper part of that, that's the room that we were all working in to build these panels. You look out over the meadow, and these in these baskets are really part of the meadow at this point in time. But we continue to kind of show how students are working together and really thinking about how to bring these baskets together. And then we at the end of this was this year's group that were still there at the end of the workshop. So it was just before the camas was really coming out of the ground. So they all got into the basket to kind of share their collective efforts together. And they're not the only ones in the baskets. There's also bunnies in the baskets. And so these aren't necessarily bunny-proof baskets by any means. They still hold our food. The image on the left, you can see the bunny in the basket having a buffet, and really kind of enjoying themselves in the basket. They have an easier time getting in than getting out. But you can see this image on the right is basically the hole that the bunny chewed to get through and into the basket itself. And so this is a really important learning experience for us as well, because of all of this work that we were doing. The initial kind of impetus for this was, how do we help to control how other species were using, understanding, and experiencing this site. And we've had some major shifts in that regard.
Before we close out, are you curious about how my auntie is and where she sits with the meadow and the harm that I did with the two worlds? Well, we worked on it, and she recently said that she is ready to move on from that harm, and she's watched the work that we have been doing in the meadow and the conversations that we're having. I was also told that I needed to, I was talking to elders about this cultural harm, right? This knowledge-based harm. And I finally learned and heard them say that I'm talking to the wrong people to figure out how to do this work in the good way. And that I needed to figure out that I'm talking to the wrong relatives. So when I slowed down and got over my grieving, or got to a place in my grieving, I realized that I'm not talking to the plants. I didn't go and sit with the camas and ask that plant species, why are you here? Where did you come from? What was your journey to end up in the meadow? And when I stopped and listened, what I heard from the camas was, although we weren't gathered by native peoples, we were gathered by people who had good hearts, and they informed us and invited us to come and be a part of this project, to come to the Burke Meadow. So we offered ourselves, and we went on this journey. And we knew you were coming, and that you were going to help us have a voice and to be present and to be the teachers for this important work that is happening in the Pacific Northwest and in the world. And so we came and we offered ourselves, and things are changing in our cultural practices, and we're going to be okay. And so with that, that's where I took and was accepted as the auntie of the meadow, and that the work is going to be difficult, it is going to be messy, but as long as we listen to the plants in the meadow and include them in the conversation, things heal. They restore, they revitalize, and we can continue on in all of the good, the bad, and the ugly that is happening. And so that's what's happening with our elder and the work. And so I continue to work in two worlds.
And through that process, and through the learning that Polly has had, and that Polly shares with the rest of us on the team, we've come to better understand that what's important in managing this meadow are not the outcomes, but it's the relationships that we're building. It's the relationships and being able to accept the bunnies in the meadow.
The lupin.
The relationship in this image also shows the lupin within the meadow. How do we expand our relations with other species? Our next phase of a project is we're just in early collaborations of working with potentially working with a group of teens to build some pollinator condos, pollinator boxes, which we saw one outside the building, which is fantastic. Bring those in to welcome our pollinators into the meadow, and an understanding of how we begin to kind of not only recognize where we are and our perspectives and our learning through this project, but how we can continually work to expand it so we recognize how all of these other species, how all of these other individuals are actually coming into play and interacting within the meadow that we have the great opportunity to work with. So looking ahead, it's continuing that good work. It's continuing kind of thinking about not only how do we keep ourselves strong, how do we keep our relationships strong, but how do we also work to expand those relationships? It's about seeking greater opportunities to share our learning. This is a fantastic setting for us to be able to share our stories and share, for Polly and I, our relationship that has evolved over the course of time. Again, I said this at the very beginning. She now smiles when she sees me. That's a huge growth for me in understanding and appreciating how our relationship has evolved. And expanding that educational potential. Not only are we on traditional lands, we're also on educational lands. And how do we bring forward those lessons for new individuals and new generations of students moving forward? But letting's not the right word, but enabling those students to define what that learning should be for them has been a really critical component. Mm-hmm. And how can we work as mentors and teachers to help elevate those ideas and move those ideas forward? Another pieces of it is burning it. We really have talked from the beginning of how do we burn this meadow? How do we bring forward some of not only the cultural practices, but also the ecological practices that help to maintain this habitat type, this ecosystem type, for centuries within our region. How do we bring that into the conversation that we do for care and empathy and drawing forward within this meadow? We're not necessarily sure how that's going to turn out. We're moving towards an opportunity to really be able to do it, which is huge.
Mm-hmm. And as we all know, we love to look at pretty flowers and expanding the beauty. What is also happening is the beauty of the relationships that we have with our students, with Steve, with each other, and with all the communities that come and visit. And all of the visitors are very curious about the work that we're doing. They're curious about the baskets. They're curious how this has become. And so they learn from the land as well when they interact with us. And we are learning from the land, and she is very happy right now that we are listening and learning from her teachings. And so she's showing up for us like we're showing up for each other. So with that, we have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you both for that lovely and inspiring talk. I'm going to, because of the time, open it up to audience questions if we have any. Yeah.
Wonderful work, really like it. My question to you is, this is a relationship with the land. And sometimes the term, like our language, particularly English language, doesn't have those words that justify some of the relationship with the land, like project and management, because I'm not a language person at all, but when I hear those words, it's like we are doing too many things. It is more Anthropocene and coming from those terms. Like, will you consider like establishing a different word or terminology to really express the work that you are doing, and what could that be?
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
And I think I feel we may get there. We're challenging the words that are being used. And right now the challenge is traditional ecological knowledge. Well, it's traditional, but we're living it. And so it's not traditional in that past context, right? And so that's an example of how we're approaching the language that is being used, but we haven't dove in and created.
Yeah, but our language has evolved, right? Like the language I bring to the project when we're speaking to the project is much less from a scientific perspective. It's much less about no longer use the Western scientific name for camas, for example, when we have these conversations. So our language is evolving, but it's a slow process, because we also recognize that not only are we understanding and working with this meadow, we are also situated within a much larger cultural context as well that uses different languages too. And so really trying to figure out how we develop an understanding in a language that is, and in different circumstances, is accessible to as many as possible. So.
Next generation will be the language. Add that to the list, Ken.
Yeah. Got it already.
It does bring to mind that Linda Tuhiwe Smith, in her decolonizing methodologies, says right up front, research is a dirty word for Indigenous peoples. So it's very, very good to remember that. But then there's also Max Liboiron's example in Pollutionist Colonialism of working with Indigenous methods in science, and I've had the good fortune of being able to correspond with Max over that. I had two really simple, straightforward questions. One is, did you attempt to introduce the lupins that were meant to be in the mix as an afterthought? So did those come in? And then also, was there an attempt to plant better bunny food somewhere else nearby to divert the attention of the bunnies? Or is camas like the thing for bunnies?
Yeah, camas is a bit like chocolate chip cookies, I think, in my world. To the bunnies, and the rabbits aren't interested in the flowers. They will eat the leaves, but they're not really interested in the leaves. What they're interested in is in the stem, and so they eat the stem coming out of that. They reside not in the meadow, but they reside in the areas that surround the meadow that have also been part of that Burke yard kind of redevelopment. And so there is materials that is already there for them to eat, but again, it's like going to the candy shop for them in many ways. At least that's one of the metaphors that I would think about bringing that forward. And then the lupin that was intended to be in there actually is in the meadow, and we think it was in the seed mix that was part of that. It just was mixed with the riverine lupin as well, and so that lupin is still in the meadow. And what's interesting, as we've pulled out the riverine lupin, the lupin that's left in the meadow is that kind of smaller, less aggressive lupin that's maintained. And so that kind of an intentional species of being there is still established, but it was really outcompeted for a long time.
And we turned the water off.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that really helped. The irrigation.
Sorry, I shut it off. I guess my question is about your engagement with facilities. And have you heard of any other cases where there's been this kind of collaboration? Because I don't hear a lot of work with facilities coming in these institutions, and this kind of lateral working and what you call it, flat hierarchy.
I can speak to that because while the majority of our attention is on the Meadow. We also have other projects across campus. Not our team necessarily, but I work with other projects across campus where facilities is a really integral partner in understanding how the work can be done on campus, and whether it's part of an urban farm that we have in one area, or whether it's part of a green wall that was designed on the side of our building. Those relationships are there, but they're not the relationships that we have with Steve, for example, of a regular, consistent, and almost constant conversation that we maintain.
We meet weekly as a team. And what I appreciate and which is really fun is Steve also has grown to be very proud of the project and the love of the work that we're doing. And his knowledge is being utilized. He teaches us every day when we're there. He also guides us in the work that we can do and can't do. And we're trying to get him here on our panels and have him come with us, and he's just not ready to do that. He likes being outside. But he said, I work across this campus and I have not been respected and cared for like you are caring for me. And so he brings his team, he brings his work study students. Whenever we have things going on, he makes sure that he gives them that opportunity as well.
Hi, very interesting project. It's very beautiful to hear about your relationship. Can you talk about whether you've seen any measurable difference, Polly, and especially you, in terms of kind of filling the pipeline, in terms of helping Native American students coming up to have awareness about University of Washington and coming into college?
That's a great question. We were just talking about this yesterday, is where are we getting our next cohort of students, and how are we going to tap them? Our Native students really get pulled in many, many directions, and so we need to get them excited about our project. We are a cultural space on the University of Washington campus that they highlight for cultural safety, which is really interesting. Go to the museum for cultural safety. Not really. And so how can we highlight and bring our project forward and get them involved? Our knowledge family is one way, but also I think we need to do a little better getting out there and letting them know the work that we have for them to engage in. So it's yes and it's like that seasonal graph showed in getting students. It's pretty similar.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm going to have to cut the questions here for time as our new panel is coming in. So join us right now for River as Architecture, Buildings Are Living Things. Thank you all. Thank you, Polly and Ken, for an amazing talk.